All this time I was sure that our marriage was strong and reliable. I was ready to do everything to make our life happy and full of love. But one day I discovered that my wife was only using me as a means to her own ends. She had cheated on me, and it was not the first time. I realized that all along she had her own plan and I was just a puppet in her hands. But I wasn't going to stay idle and decided to get back at her for her betrayal. Matvi and Alina had known each other since high school. The boy had been in love with the first beauty of their school for many years, and once even worked up the courage to ask her out. But she sharply rejected him. She preferred to go out with a cocky high school student named Pasha. He seemed mature and very cool to her. Matvi sometimes heard other girls whispering behind his back discussing his unrequited love. And Alina herself was with Pavel right up until graduation. After graduation, Matvi studied at university working in parallel, and after graduation began to rise by leaps and bounds on the career ladder. He managed to get a job at an international company. He began to earn a lot of money. He bought himself a spacious apartment and a nice car and helped his parents. He also liked to travel. The impressions of travel greatly energized him. One day he was invited to another meeting of classmates. Matvi decided to go there for a change. It was there that his meeting with Alina took place many years later. When she saw Matvi, she could not even believe her eyes. The man, though clothed, was restrained, but she roughly understood the cost of all these things on him. They were talking. Alina questioned her former suitor with great interest about what he was living now, and by the minute she was getting more and more into some kind of relationship with him. They exchanged phone numbers, and the next day Alina was the first to call. Now after all these years she herself made a date with Matvi. Over all these years he had not lost his warm feelings for Alina, and although in the past she had rejected him and dated someone else, none of that mattered. Now they met as adults, and Matvi was glad that Alina was finally interested in him herself. Their relationship began very quickly. Alina knew what she wanted from this life, so the slow development of the novel did not interest her. Their wedding took place just 6 months later. Although Matvi's parents tried to tell him it was too soon, and it was still necessary to get to know each other better, they began to travel together. Matvi showed his wife various countries and their local colors. Alina watched everything with her mouth open and was as excited as a child. When they returned to their city, the woman began to take more and more of her work from Hula, explaining that she was not feeling well. At the same time, she often began to complain to her husband that she was very tired of working. Her bosses didn't appreciate her, and she felt that she was wasting her time there. These were no longer subtle hints but real manipulations, and Matvi fell for it. He still could not rejoice that the love of his youth, now his lawful spouse. Of course, after all this talk, he himself suggested that she quit her job and rest at home. He would take care of everything. Alina's dream finally came true. She lives in her husband's luxurious apartment. He allows her not to work and does not deny her anything. They live like this for a few more years. And then her husband's business trip, which lasted several weeks, happened. He and his wife would call each other late at night, but sometimes she would miss a call, claiming that she was very tired from the day. When Matvi returned, it was as if the atmosphere in his home had changed. His wife did not welcome him with the same joy as usual. She acted rather reserved and even a little aloof, which really hurt the man. He thought she had something going on or was just in a bad mood, so he didn't emphasize it. Intuitively, he sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't give it much thought. During the next month that he was in town, his wife's being just as slightly different. She started spending more and more time with her girlfriends, sometimes returning home and even later than her husband. When Matvi asked her what she was doing all that time away from home, she said that her best friend was also out of work now, and they went to salons and sports centers together or just went for a walk. One day Matvi was supposed to have a business meeting at a restaurant in the center of town. On that day things did not go well from the very morning. First he left important documents at home, and on his way back to pick them up, he was late for work. Then some minor mishaps at the office threw him off balance, and now he was stuck in a traffic jam not far from that very restaurant. As he sat in his car, irritably texting his colleague that he might be late because of the traffic situation, his attention was caught by 2 silhouettes gliding outside the window. Matvi looked up and saw a couple. His wife was walking with some man and was hanging out with him interestedly. The husband's previously unknown feeling of jealousy pricked him. He could see for sure that it was his wife and how she was enjoying herself in the company of another man. Interesting choice of girlfriends she has, of course. He thought irritatedly. The traffic was moving very slowly and Matvey decided to follow where the two men were going. They were going straight to the restaurant where Matvey himself was headed. After about 10 minutes all the cars parted and the man was able to turn around and park beside the place. He went in very carefully, looking around to see where his wife was sitting but at the same time not to get caught. He was lucky. The table at which his meeting was taking place was at a decent distance from the table where Alina was sitting with her companion. While this colleague was talking to his partners, Matvey was watching his wife without blinking. At last he could make out who she was with. The face seemed painfully familiar, but the man had to strain his memory hard to figure out who it was. With horror to himself, he recognized in her companion, Paul, the same one Alina had dated back in high school. With each passing minute his faith in the best was evaporating faster and faster. Alina openly flirted with Pasha and at one point he began stroking her thigh. Matvey desperately wanted to take out the anger that was boiling inside of him on these two. But he was held hostage to the situation. The meeting was very important. He could not lose face. As a result, the man thought, since these two were acting this way, their relationship had not lasted the first day. Yes, he was hurt because of this infidelity. He was ready to tear up and throw up. But he understood that these emotions would not make things better. He could deal with the unfaithful spouse later, but now he had better things to do. He concentrated on the negotiations and held them to the highest standard. Alina and her lover left before he did. It was obvious they were in a hurry to finally get some privacy. Afterwards, Matvey drove home. He threw all of Alina's belongings into bags and took them to the nearest garbage can. When the trader returned home, she was extremely surprised. The door was locked from the inside with a latch. Then her husband opened it. He said that now she no longer lived here, and if she had time, she could still fight the local bums at the dump for her clothes. The woman first thought her husband was joking, but when the door slammed in her face, she realized that he had found out. The couple divorced. Matvey was even glad that his mother had insisted on a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. It turned out to be very convenient. Alina never once apologized to Matvey for her betrayal. Nothing bad happened for her. She simply acted out of self-interest. For a long time after school, she was constantly on and off with Pavel because he could not provide her with everything. But when she found out that Pavel's financial situation had improved, she was the first to make contact. In fact, he was the only one she really loved. But his plight a few years ago prevented her from staying with him. She met Matthew and realized that he could give her the life she wanted. Now she began to live with Pavel again. Matvey understood that Alina would forever be the one who would be constantly on the lookout for a better place. She would change her partners an endless number of times without sticking with anyone for long. Instead of building a future with her husband, helping him and reaching for the heights together, she has chosen to live a parasitic lifestyle. But life is complicated, and staying on the crest of success all the time won't work. Black bars happen to everyone. So the claim that Paul was lucky to stay with such a woman together was highly questionable. She would stay with him, but only until his first bad luck. Second story. I might never have known the truth about my wife, but when my friend suddenly showed up with the words, "I need to tell you something about your wife," I felt something was wrong. I couldn't even think what he was going to say, but what followed was so amazing that I didn't know what to do next. It turned out that my wife had been cheating on me for months. And my friend had known about it all along. He told me everything he knew, and I decided to take justice into my own hands. I got my revenge on her for cheating. In this video, I will tell you the whole story, and you will learn how I found out the truth about my wife, and how I decided to get revenge on her. Ruslan and Sofia had been married for 6 years. Sonia was a manicurist, and Ruslan worked for a small company as a landscape designer. A couple of years ago, they took an apartment on a mortgage, and were gradually fixing it up. The couple had been trying for over a year to have a child. Both were ready to take on the role of parents, but nothing worked. Even though they had already had some tests done, and everything was normal, they did not want to take any drastic steps. so they just kept hoping that someday they would finally get lucky. Ruslan had a good friend whose name was Andrew. The man, unlike his companion, was lonely and lived alone. He did not have much luck in relationships. At some point he had already accepted this state of affairs, and stopped busting his net to get acquainted with anyone. He was comfortable enough as it was. They had met in high school and had been in touch ever since. As adults they didn't see each other that often, but when they did meet it was as if they hadn't been together all that time. One afternoon Andrew was going about his business, and decided to walk through the park. His head was occupied with the repairs he was making, so he hardly paid any attention to those who passed him by. Suddenly he stumbled over some rock in the middle of the path, and it snapped him out of his heap of thoughts. He glanced around to see if anyone had noticed his fall, when suddenly he spotted a familiar silhouette ahead. He stepped a little closer and recognized her. It was Sophia, his friend's wife. She was walking in the company of a man. "Sonia, hello," shouted Andrew, walking a little closer. The woman turned around. "Andrew, hello. I didn't expect to see you here." The man had already held out his hand to her companion to say hello. "Andre Costillo." At that moment the woman tensed a little. She bit her lip and then said with a laugh, "This is my brother. He came to town for the day, here to give us a tour. We're really in a bit of a hurry, sorry." Andrew replied that it was no big deal. He asked him to say hello to Ruslan, and then they said goodbye. He stared intently at Konstantine's face. Something tensed him in the whole situation. It was either Sanja's reaction or her hurry. For a second he even thought there was far from a kinship between these two. But the telephone call from a client distracted him, pushing the man's doubts away. In the flow of events and working moments, Andrew had completely forgotten about the situation in the park. He was not even surprised at the absence of a call from Ruslan. Usually, if he said hello to him through his acquaintances, he considered it his duty to call and meet him. But the friend did not show up until a few months later. One evening, Ruslan dialed his comrade and informed him in a joyful voice that soon he would finally become a father. Nothing much had happened before that. And here is the real news, and I decided to share it with you. Andrew sincerely congratulated his friend. He knew how long he and his wife had come to this. At the end of the year, in the winter, Ruslan even invited him to the maternity hospital to be discharged. Afterward, they sat together for a while and celebrated. Later, there was a lull. The couple fully immersed themselves in taking care of the baby. The world began to revolve around him. From time to time, they would write to each other. But for the most part, Ruslan was immersed in his work to provide his family with everything they needed. They had not seen each other for over a year. And one day on his day off, Andrew was passing through the neighborhood where his comrade lived. He had to pick up an order at the pickup point, which was in their house. And by happy coincidence, he met Ruslan in the street. He was strolling along with the stroller. Andre shouted at him and he gestured for him to keep his voice down. The child dozed off. It turned out that his wife had sent him for a walk with his son and wanted to relax and unwind. The friends were talking. Andrew looked at the little boy and asked if he could tell what the child looked like. He looked more like his mother. He didn't take anything from me as if he didn't like it, apparently. He made a joke. My friend did not appreciate the joke. He suddenly remembered seeing his wife with some stranger whom she introduced as her brother. And this was not long before the news of the pregnancy. I'm sorry, don't take this the wrong way. But have you ever considered that the baby might not be yours? Andre asked seriously. Ruslan looked at him like he was crazy. He laughed and asked why he suddenly thought so. A friend snapped and decided to tell him that he had seen his wife with someone in the park at the time. After that, Ruslan was not so cheerful anymore. Well, hello. She certainly didn't tell me from you. She didn't say that she saw you at all. And your brother? Kostya, you say? She doesn't have any brothers and I don't remember any cousins, he said thoughtfully. And she certainly did not tell me that any of her relatives visited her at that time. This news shook Ruslan. He still felt euphoric that he finally had his heir. Besides, he had always found that he and his wife had a good relationship. But now doubts about his wife's faithfulness had settled in his mind. Yes, and at a time when they were ready to give up and she suddenly became pregnant. At that time, Ruslan thought it was a miracle. But now everything was covered with a shroud of doubt. He thanked his friend for telling him about the incident, even though it was so much later. That night, he had waited for his wife's return more anxiously than ever before. He knew there was a serious talk to be had. As he waited for her, sitting in complete silence in the kitchen, he went over in his head all the suspicious things that he might in the past have simply turned a blind eye to. When their next attempt to have a baby failed, he felt at one point as if his wife had grown cold to the idea altogether. She didn't say she changed her mind, but you could feel it in the look on her face. Then there was even some coldness between them, but Ruslan put it down to hormonal background. The man decided to call his mother-in-law and find out from the source whether there was a certain Constantine among his wife's brothers after all. He veiled this strange question by saying that a certain man came to their house when Sonia was away and introduced himself as her brother. Our fears had already been confirmed. There was no such man among her cousins or even third cousins. When the man hung up, Sonia had just returned home. After she had checked on the baby, the man decided to start a conversation. He began from afar, mentioning Kostya, who had recently dropped in on her as if to visit. Ruslan decided not to specify the degree of their relationship, and just watched her reaction. Sonia did not make eye contact. She constantly looked away. When the man's name came up, it was as if she tensed up. But she tried not to show it. "Do you know him, dear?" her husband asked in a calm tone. "Yes, he's a former colleague.